All right, I'm gonna start broadcasting now.
Okay.
Do you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Hello, everyone who's joined us. We're scheduled to start at 6 o'clock, so we've got just a couple minutes. You kind of settle in, get your last refill or whatever, and we'll get started here in a few minutes. Okay, hello everybody. Oh. So before we get started, we just want to make sure that everything is working. So if you can hear me, we would ask you maybe just drop a note in the chat box. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We always like to see where folks are joining us from. It's always fun for us. And then if you run into any technical issues throughout the evening, feel free to drop a note in the chat box and we'll do our best to make sure that you're taken care of. So looks like we've got folks from Holly, Colorado, Kyle, Texas. All right, downtown Denver, Fort Collins, Virginia, Oregon. Nice. So it looks good. So we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Eric Carpia. I'm the director of the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center and also the Deputy Community Museum Officer for History Colorado. Here this evening with Zach Workowicz, Director of Community Relations for History Colorado, as well as our featured speaker, Maria Sanchez Tucker. Tonight's discussion is part of our Borderlands of Southern Colorado project, which is a collaboration between 3 of History Colorado's community museums, El Pueblo History Museum in Pueblo, Colorado, Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center in Fort Garland, and Trinidad History Museum in Trinidad, Colorado. The project overall explores the Borderlands history of Southern Colorado through a variety of exhibits, lectures, educational activities, and online programming. Before I introduce Maria, I'd like to thank the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area for their generous support of the Borderlands lecture series. It's through their generosity as well as the support of you, our community, that projects like these are possible. I think as many of you know, tonight's program is offered purely on a donation basis. So we invite you to support our Borderlands project by clicking on the Colorado Gives link that we'll drop in the chat box. We had several questions about this last week and learned on the fly that apparently Zoom doesn't allow you to just click on the link and go directly to the donation page or any other page. You actually have to copy and paste the link into another browser. So just be aware of that. We'll drop it in there again at the end of the evening if you're looking for it. Even a small donation of $5 or $10 allows us to continue to offer projects like these. So thank you in advance for any support that you can provide to us. We're just going to go back before we introduce Maria again, go back to our chat box. It looks like we've got folks from Montrose, Colorado, from Antonito, just up the road from where I'm at, Colorado Springs, New Mexico. I do want to give a special shout out to Miss Grandel's middle schoolers at Ken Carl Middle School in Littleton, Colorado. They told us this morning that they were going to be doing a live viewing party. And then we've got a group of middle schoolers that are going to come up with some questions and they're going to funnel them to us this evening. So thanks for including this in your curriculum. We think that's pretty awesome. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Maria Sanchez Tucker. For those of you joining us from Pueblo, and I know there's several of you out there from Pueblo, you likely know Maria from her previous role at the Pueblo Public Library. Currently, she's serving as the director of the Santa Fe Public Library in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Maria's here this evening to share her knowledge and her interest in a very timely topic, and that's the Spanish influenza of 1918, and specifically the impact that it had in Pueblo and in Southern Colorado. At the conclusion of her presentation, she'll take questions from the audience, so feel free during her talk to drop questions in the chat box at any time. We'll be sure to pass those along during our discussion at the end. With that, Maria, welcome. We're glad to have you this evening.
Do I need to share my screen now?
Yeah, please.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. It's so nice to see so many friendly names in the chat box. I'm just really honored to be part of this series with so many wonderful speakers. What a great program for History Colorado to present to the public. This presentation that I put together was originally developed in 2018 with the assistance of Hannah Weber, who was an archivist at the Pueblo City County Library District. We put this together as part of the centennial of World War I. And so I am definitely not an expert on the Spanish flu, but I have a real interest in it, and we'll get to that part of the story later on why I'm so interested in researching this history. So let's begin. So 100 years ago in 1917, the entire world was engaged in warfare on a global scale. And at the time, it probably seemed as though things could not get any worse. Young men were being shipped overseas to an unknown fate in war, and most often they did not return in the same state, if they did at all. And on the home front, all US citizens saw their lives drastically changed by the effects of war, and those who were lost to war. They were adjusting to giving up everyday staples for the war, filling the shoes who left for the war, and being outcast if they had ethnic ties to Germany. So everyone was part of the Great War in some way or another. And it was unimaginable that their lives could change much more. The Great War was consuming daily life. Yet, in the spring of 1918, a new silent killer emerged. The Spanish flu stealthily took center stage for a brief time in 1918 and reminded the world that things could get much, much worse. The Spanish flu brought fear and death to the doorsteps of every household worldwide. So it's very interesting because the 1918 flu pandemic had effects on families and genealogy. And it really touched the lives of almost all family structures. If you look back in your own genealogy and you look back at this time period, 1917 through 1919, you might notice that people passed away, that names changed, that people were remarried, kids were adopted. So many people died that it really affected the structure of families. And so I became very interested in this because my grandfather had mentioned that his father, his biological father, passed away from the 1918 flu. And so I began researching because I thought it was very interesting that he remembered this story. So this is my grandfather in this photo, this boy. His name is Monico Salvania, and he was my grandfather, and his father and two siblings died in 1918, leaving his mother a widow. And although he was 4 at the time, he had a remarkable memory, and I'd like to share with you his story of this traumatic and life-changing event. And so here is how he remembers this story. It was evening, just getting dark, and I was outside playing when my mother called me into the house. My mother was sitting on the pallet on the floor, and she was cradling my dad's head in her lap. She told me to give her the little holy bell, which was in the niche in the wall. I couldn't quite reach it and jumped for it, and it fell on the floor. That's when my father died. My mother said, "It's too late, he's dead. Go tell your grandma your daddy's dead." My grandma lived a few blocks away, and I ran to tell her my daddy was dead. I remember the funeral. 2 men carried him to the cemetery in a black box. I was only 4 years old. The purpose of the little holy bell was that at the moment of death, it was rung to summon the angels to escort the soul to heaven. Also, it was rung to ward off the devil. Basilia, his mother, was left with 2 children to raise on her own. In order to survive, she had to find work, so she learned of some friends who were walking to San Francisco in Guanajuato, Mexico, and she asked if she could join them. The friends were agreeable to this arrangement. And so his mother left him with her parents and went to Pueblo, eventually went to Pueblo, Colorado, where she looked for work. She remarried at that time, where she married a man named Saldana. But she came back and got my grandfather and brought him back to Pueblo, and he eventually grew up in Pueblo and became a steel worker. But it was interesting when I heard this story, I thought, I didn't pay much attention to it because we didn't really think much of the 1918 flu. But then I started thinking about it and wondered, is this story true? And so I started doing genealogical research and found this record that's on the screen of his father, who was named Cirilo Martinez. So my grandfather's name was Martinez, and I found his death record that was in October of 1918. So it verified his story, and it was just amazing to me that he had that recollection. So really, it impacted families all over the globe. So the Spanish flu affected 50 million people worldwide. Of those 500 million people, a conservative estimate of 50 to 100 million people died. And at that time, there was around 3 to 5% of the world's population. An estimated of 10 to 20% of infected died. The life expectancy during the First World War for the time period 1917 to 1918 was already quite low, age 50 for men and age 55 for women due to the widespread disease and lack of hygiene and medicine. I'm gonna see if I can a little bit better. So due to the widespread disease and lack of hygiene and medicine at that time, it dropped by 12 years in 1918 due to the emergence of the Spanish flu. So it went from 50 to 38 for men and 55 to 43 for women. To put that into perspective, the number of Spanish flu deaths, the entirety of World War I caused the deaths of 41 million civilians and military personnel on a global scale. The Spanish flu caused, at a conservative estimate, a total of 50 million deaths worldwide. And I say conservative estimate as those are not the exact statistics, because sometimes when people died of pneumonia, they classified it as pneumonia and not the flu. The pneumonia was a secondary symptom of the flu, and many people died from that. So I'm going to skip on why the flu is so deadly because it's kind of complicated, and if we have time, we'll come back around to that, and you can stay and ask me questions on what I know about that. I'm definitely not a medical expert, but it is fascinating why the flu was so deadly, but it did mutate into a very, very deadly form of flu. So there are different perspectives, theories about where it actually emerged. And so epidemiologist Edwin Oakes Jordan in a 1927 study said there were 3 possible epicenters for the Spanish flu: British military camps in Great Britain, Haskell, Kansas, or China. And so really, I think the main theory is that it was probably in Kansas where it did emerge. So the first wave occurred in the spring of 1918. And it consisted of a few deaths, with the majority of people simply being sick. And the military is what mostly suffered in the spring of 1918. And the second wave was in the fall of 1918, or mainly August through December of 1918. And that was the deadly wave. The second wave caused the majority of deaths, soldiers and civilians alike, especially from secondary pneumonia infections. It was so severe that it caused people to be blue from the lack of oxygen and to cough up blood. And most often healthy adults between the ages of 18 and 40 were the victims of the flu due to the cytokine storm that took over their body. And sometimes you'll probably hear that now when we're talking about the coronavirus, how the immune system attacks itself. So again, it was these healthy adults that the flu caused the most, with their healthy immune system, that it caused the most robust immune systems to work against them and to kill them. And so that was also a part of this genealogical aspect, is that healthy young adults of childbearing age were dying. And then there was a final wave of the flu in the winter of 1918 through 1919, and in some places it extended into 1920. So, so how did the Spanish flu affect Colorado, the region, and Pueblo? In Colorado, between September 1918 and June 1919, an estimated 7,783 people died from the flu, with nearly 1,500 of those people living in Denver. And so as you can see here, in 1917, Colorado had an estimated population of 910,000 people. And in 1918, the statewide population dropped to 906,000. In 1919, post-war, we then see the population return and right itself, as it usually does after a war, with a surge to 938,000 people. It's believed that Colorado had one of the highest mortality rates in the country because of a larger ratio of the population with compromised lung function due to the large amount of minors and tubercular patients in the state. And so the flu spread across Colorado and hit many small towns hard due to the few doctors and limited medical resources and limited access to those resources. However, some small towns like Gunnison were able to avoid the high infection rate by essentially quarantining the entire town for months. So here are a couple of pictures from a scrapbook from the Pueblo City County Library collection. This was a personal family scrapbook, and it shows a woman wearing a flu mask that she made, and she took a picture of it. Now we're all taking selfies with our masks, right? And then some Red Cross nurses. And really the nurses were the unsung heroes of the flu. So many women were called in to help with the war, to help with sick patients who were, when the hospitals didn't have actual nurses, women stepped in and assisted. So the Red Cross and the nurses were really very important. And so how long did our community react and deal with this imminent threat? While the sickness was ravaging the world, the United States, Colorado, and Pueblo, and the citizens of Pueblo did as much as the United States. They took an approach of keep calm and carry on. When seeking to persevere through this hardship, the Pueblo chieftain during this period of the deadly second wave sought to educate citizens while also assuring them that the situation is under control. That with constant vigilance, we would all persevere. Mainly the newspapers focused on war news. The flu rarely ever made a headline. And I think that was really astounding to me when I was looking through the newspaper cases, was that they would record these flu deaths and they would be just small little articles in the middle of the newspaper, but the main focus was on the war effort. So the flu rarely ever made a headline or made the front pages. And yet again, while the main news sought to keep a positive light shining on the situation, small bits of fear mongering were definitely used to emphasize the severity of the situation, enough to ensure that the public adhered to the health department's regulations to combat the sickness. In addition to reporting on the number of cases and deaths of the flu in the community, the chieftain also was a location where the health department advised the public on best practices for combating the flu. And so here's a picture of a couple of Red Cross nurses that passed away. They were from Pueblo and they passed away when they were over at war. 4 deaths yesterday of flu epidemic believed controlled. And so, you know, you can see that everybody was still very hopeful that we were making it through and containing, flattening the curve, I guess is what it would have been. So according to the health department and community medical officials, typical things that we do to talk about today to recognize the combat of the flu were also suggested to the public. Keep in mind, when we talked about that earlier, that poor hygiene, the health department was putting out, you know, to wash your hands and to say, stay safe. So the public was educated on best hygiene practices, and society began to now internalize these practices today that we all learned as children. And here is a few ways that they put in the newspaper about how to prevent the flu. Keep away from those who have bad colds, cover your mouth. Keep your living rooms well ventilated. Keep the room where you work full of fresh air. Actually, that probably wasn't the best idea for people who were having pneumonia symptoms. Keep children who have bad colds away from school. Spend all the time you can out of doors. Keep your body in healthy condition, and do not neglect what you may call a bad cold. And then here is a little poem that was put out to the public from a Pueblo woman, and she says, all over the whole United States there travels a pest that pesticates, and as it comes to each little town it brings to population down. If we aren't careful, we'll have it too, this dreadful thing they call a flu, the flu. The man who runs the health department is a man I know. I tell you, that's pretty smart. He did everything a man could do to lock out our visitor and the flu. He closed schools, churches, and movie shows, and everything closable, I suppose. So doesn't this poem fit in with what we're dealing with right now? So yes, we started closing things. We also made it so that if you were not wearing a mask, you would be subject to arrest. This article right here said that there was 9 deaths yesterday from the disease and 143 new cases from the health department. And Pueblo actually had a very robust health department because of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and Dr. Richard Corwin, who was the head surgeon of the CFNI. Because of him, they took strong steps in Pueblo, and they made some pretty strong public health guidelines to try to combat the flu. So you can see that the influenza postponed the meetings. Until further notice, only the immediate family of the deceased person, a minister, singer, and accompanist will be permitted to attend a funeral service by order of the health department. And you may return the books to the public library, but the library was closed. Now here's kind of a humorous story. Somebody wore an influenza mask and was mistaken for a burglar. And so, you know, it's kind of a funny story that talked about how the man was mistaken for a holdup, and it was only by chance that he was not arrested. So it's kind of a funny story. So be careful when you're wearing your mask outside. Here's some other advertisements. Buy Liberty Bonds, fighting the flu. And this was a quote from the Denver's Rialto Theater. I shall sacrifice gladly all that I have and hope to have, if by doing so I can be the means of saving one life. And I think that was important, that that people were trying to do their best to make sure that they did not spread the illness. However, like with most things, there's always those who will do just about anything to make a dollar on the situation. And the Chieftain also contained many advertisements at the time which prostrated wonder cures and in ways which one could avoid catching the flu. In addition, many people turned to cultural medicines when it seemed that nothing else would assure them of immunity. So this dairy was selling pure milk that would be a good cure for the flu. A lot of advertising. Here's one of those wonder treatments that was being proposed, a preventative treatment against influenza. So one of the really interesting things I found was that here in Pueblo and Southern Colorado, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company helped to assist the greater community in combating the influenza pandemic. And when the flu hit Pueblo in October of 1918, CFNI, as well as the Minnequa Hospital, found themselves as unprepared for the onslaught of infected that would flock to their wards. Staff soon found themselves working around the clock in order to deal with the hordes of sick needing attention. Additional space for sick wards were sought out at the CFNI, and the club and buildings of the various coal camps were requisitioned for emergency hospitals. And so Dr. Corwin was able to obtain flu serum, like a vaccination. And this picture right here, employees and families during the influenza epidemic, he was able to secure some flu serum from the Mayo Clinic because he would happen to be friends with the family. And so he was able to get this flu vaccine, and they gave it to as many workers and community members as possible. So the industrial bulletin that you can actually look up online was the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company's company newspaper. They emphasized that the vaccine was at once distributed to all the camps, to the steelworks dispensary, and to the hospital, where all employees, members of their families, and in fact any person, whether connected with the company or not, urged to apply the company doctor and receive free of charge the vaccine. 4,500 vaccines were given out at the steelworks dispensary alone. In addition, the hospital at CFNI treated 4,600 cases of flu, which is astounding given that Minnequa Hospital almost exclusively dealt with flu cases for the citizens of Pueblo. However, out of all the victories between October and December, the deadly second wave of the flu, 638 Puebloans were claimed by the Spanish flu. So unfortunately, You know, 638 out of the 7,800 isn't bad, but this flu serum was definitely not a true vaccine, but it was interesting that they tried to vaccinate. What I think they were trying to vaccinate for was a type of pneumonia, thinking that that would help. So those were the numbers: 4,600 treated, 4,500 vaccinated, 628 people died from influenza in Pueblo. So for Pueblo, the flu winds down by the end of November. And by December 3rd, some of the restrictions that were in place to combat the spread of the flu began to be lifted. And life finally begins to go back to normal. When the third and final wave hits the winter, people are now vigilant enough that it doesn't hit as badly as the second wave. In addition, those that have had the flu and survived have built up immunity, as well as those who received the vaccine. Perhaps it did help. I'm not sure about that. And the final wave doesn't affect Pueblo as intensely as it is among the rest of the United States. So on the right here, we see an article that talks about how flu ended up killing more American than German bullets. And so the third wave passes and the Spanish flu pandemic is somewhat forgotten. With the intensity of the war and everything that went on during that time period, the flu most often gets pushed into the background, even though it had a greater global effect on society in many ways. While there are war memorials remembering all those who perished during World War I, there are no memorials to the masses that perished due to the Spanish influenza. It was a silent killer that emerged during World War I and created a war of its own. However, from this experience, society has gained a knowledge for the best practices for preparing for sicknesses and other flu epidemics that periodically emerge. The greatest remembrance that we have of the Spanish flu of 1918 is what we as society learned from enduring it. And so it's really interesting to come back to this talk knowing what we're going through right now and what we're experiencing. I had always thought about what it must have been like to go through this time where people had to be so scared of losing a loved one, not knowing, you know, who was going to get sick. And now we're almost in the same parallel situation. So hopefully you found a few of those stories interesting, and I will answer the questions to my best of my ability. But thank you all for joining me tonight.
Hey, thank you, Maria. That's outstanding. We do have several questions. I'm going to start with a couple of our student questions. First that we have, one student asks, how did the flu affect minority populations? And was there a difference between how it impacted minority populations and others like we're seeing today?
You know, I think that probably poorer populations didn't have access to as many hygiene. So that could have been it could have happened that minority populations could have been affected more, but really the flu did not discriminate. It affected everybody. And because there wasn't as great knowledge as we have now of medical technology, people did not, you know, really know exactly how it was spread. And so, you know, Zach was bringing up that people went outside. They congregated outside thinking that that would protect them because they were not indoors. But there really wasn't enough knowledge, and so really almost everybody was affected by it, and it didn't discriminate. But it is interesting how some people had more immunity than others. Some did not get as affected. So like in my personal case, my grandfather was fine, his mother was fine, and one of his siblings was okay, but he lost 2 siblings and a father. And so, you know, some people in the family it affected and some did not.
So this is a good question. In your research, did you find out whether there are any food or supply shortages like we're seeing today?
You know, so I didn't see much of that, but one of the interesting things that I thought I've just recently found out was that people, you were discouraged from shopping. And so you could call in your grocery order and go pick it up. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I think there were food shortages because of the war, but I didn't see a lot of that there was definitely not any stories about toilet paper hoarding. So I didn't see much of that, but probably just with any wartime economy, there would be shortages.
Yeah. What about in terms of mitigation? Were those decisions left up to states and counties and local government, or was the federal government involved?
So the federal government, from what I've seen, and probably there's more research on this, but just from my research of the newspapers, the federal government, Uncle Sam, you know, they would give messages about washing your hands, hygiene, safety first, those type of messages. The focus was so much on the war that I think local governments took that into their own hands. So definitely the states were involved. Pueblo put in their own ordinances. You can see that Gunnison took their ordinances into their own hands and quarantined the entire county. So I think a lot of local governments were making decisions. Some people eased restrictions sooner than others, and I think those that lifted restrictions really were affected more. Pueblo kept their restrictions in place until December.
Okay. It seemed like a lot of your research is based on primary sources and newspaper resources at the time. Could you tell whether there had been any media censorship of flu coverage? That's another student question that we got.
That's interesting. You know, I think the messaging was probably, I think like I said, there was a little bit of fear mongering to get people to wash their hands and to practice the social distancing now that we're calling it. But I really can't say that there was any sort of media censorship.
What about diagnoses? How were cases diagnosed? Did they have a test for the presence of the virus?
You know, so they didn't even know that viruses existed. People thought that this was a bacteria probably. And so we didn't even know about viruses. So there was no test. They knew that, you know, they called it the influenza, but they didn't really actually know the germ that was causing it. So that's kind of interesting. They must, like I said, they would start with the flu-like symptoms, get very, very sick, and then it would usually turn into a severe pneumonia with just lung failure.
So we have a fascinating question from Amber. She's asking, were there protests like there are today? People anxious to get back to normal, right?
Maybe not protests, but definitely I saw an article when I was looking. I didn't have time to really update a lot, but I did see some. If you go onto the Colorado Historic Newspaper Collection, it's great. Search influenza, you'll see so many different articles. And I did see one where preachers and businessmen were pushing back. And so it's almost a parallel to what's going on today. People want to congregate, people need the economy, they want their businesses to thrive, and so there was pushback on that. And so it was the same, where they were trying to balance people and getting sick.
Yeah, and I've just personally recently heard that it was as a result of that really the second wave came back. And has there been any mention of that, or did you find anything related to another wave in Pueblo or in Colorado?
You know, the second wave was the worst, and then, like I said, it came a little bit, the third wave was not as bad. So either people were developing more immunity, or people just were understanding, you know, better hygiene, washing their hands, those type of things. But the second wave was definitely the worst. But you would still have articles that would go into 1920 of people dying of the flu. So it was sporadic all the way into 1920.
Yeah. So we're getting several questions about the name, the Spanish flu. You know, I think one question around like, why was it called the Spanish flu if it didn't start there? We got another question from Magdalena who's asking, is it correct that the flu pandemic of 1917 to 1918 started in Kansas and began with contact of a person and an animal? Can you talk about some of the origins, what you've heard about that?
So, yeah, that's a great question. The Spanish flu, it's sort of like the Chinese flu. It was not properly named. The first media attention took place in Spain when people were dying and it came out in the media. And so it was equated with the location where people were first noticing it in the media. And so it became the Spanish influenza, but it did not start in Spain. But it was equated with that because that's where it was first put out through the media. And what was the second part of that question, Eric?
About its connection to Kansas.
Oh, right. So
a theory that I think it began in Kansas.
Yeah, so there was a camp. Let me see if I can go back to my notes. There was the military camps. In Haskell, Kansas, there was a military camp. And so they think that possibly it could have transferred from a pig. A lot of the soldiers were in really confined quarters. And so the population was just together, really close quarters, not a lot of good hygiene in those places. And so it was just ripe for a mutation from a zoonotic, is what they call it, occurrence where it transfers from an animal to a human. And so they think that's possibly where it was, but there's still, 3 possible epicenters: China and Great Britain. But if you look up Edwin Oakes Jordan, he wrote about it in 1927 and what his theories were.
Great. So I'm going to take just a pause real quick because Jody put in a great plug and she's thinking along the same lines that we were. She put in the chat box for everybody that History Colorado's Lost Highways podcast just released an episode on the Spanish flu, and I think they talk a little bit about the impact in Colorado, particularly in mining communities and mountain communities. So I think Zach dropped the URL to that podcast in the chat box. So if you are interested in learning more after Maria's presentation, we would invite you to check out Lost Highways to learn more about that. Just back to questions, Maria, we're getting some questions about how people combated the flu. One question, how did people combat the flu with the level of medical knowledge that existed at the time? We've got another question kind of related, asking about like folk and home remedies and folk remedies. Did your research produce anything that was shared about how people could recover?
I think just traditional medicines, people would use those. There was some reading about keeping your bowels clear was one way to make sure that you did not get the flu. So castor oil, they'd recommend taking castor oil. And I'm sure just different communities had different type of cultural medicines that they would use. In fact, my grandmother, she was Greek and Lebanese, and she said that nobody in her family was affected by the flu because they ate a lot of garlic. So I recommend to everybody, up your garlic intake right now, because maybe grandma was right. So I think I didn't see a lot of specifics about cultural medicines, but I know that those were taking place. And then there were also the snake oil medicines that were out that people were being sold on, these wonder cures and things like that, that they had a lot of ads for, that they were trying to sell their different snake oil type medicine where they were saying it would cure the flu. So that was many advertisements in the newspapers.
Okay. Another question relating the issue to things we see happening today. Question about whether there were, in your research, you found disproportionate mortality rates with immunocompromised people or people who are vulnerable to toxic environments. What comes to mind are like miners, maybe in Pueblo, still workers. How was that?
The interesting thing about this flu is that at some point between the first wave and the second wave, it mutated to this deadly strain. And so from what my understanding is that people of all ages died from the flu, but it was really affecting the healthy, strong, young, childbearing age people. And so that's not typical of what a flu does. A flu usually affects young, old, weak immune systems. And so this was the exact opposite. And so the environmental conditions that we had, it just, for some reason, this flu attacked your own immune system with a healthy immune system attacked itself basically. And so it enhanced the immuno response with this cytokine storm that that you'll hear about when people are talking about how some people with the coronavirus are getting sick and having more extreme symptoms. So it was really the opposite. It was more healthy people that were dying that was really the anomaly and really the shocking part to this and tragic part of this flu that made it really even more tragic.
Can you talk about the economic impact? There's a question specific to Pueblo because of the impact maybe on CFNI, but other mentions about economic impact in the region?
You know, I didn't research that part of it. I'm sure that it did have some economic impact. I didn't see a lot of that. I think with World War I, possibly that kept industries going. So I didn't see a lot of that, but I'm sure it was going on. But this was more of a private, you know, when people, it's even now when you get sick with this COVID-19, you pass away in the hospital alone. You can't have visitors. Well, people kept to themselves. It was really a private thing happening in families, and not like the war where that was a big public situation that everybody was rallying around, whether people got sick. And then people were more, at that time period, they were used to illness. They didn't have the same kind of medical technology that we had, so they were used to people passing away. And so it was more of a commonplace type situation, I think.
So question about the vaccine. Again, several questions. One person's asking, what were doctors prescribing? Was the vaccine available at the start of the outbreak? You know, did it really work? And then again, how much time did it take to develop and maybe obtain from the Mayo Clinic? So there's lots of questions in there.
Yeah, so the vaccine thing is really interesting, and I don't know that I have enough medical knowledge to really explain it, but I think they were vaccinating against a bacteria is what they came up with. So like I said, they didn't really have the knowledge of a virus. And so if you Google, or I could even put it in the chat box or send it to Eric and he could send it out, the article that I looked up that talked about the Mayo Clinic's vaccine, there's an entire National Institute of Health article about it. And it's really interesting. It's way above my head because it's actually written by doctors, but it's fascinating if anybody wants to look into that. So I don't think that it actually worked against what they were. Maybe in some cases it could have helped, but I don't think it did. So, but they were trying different types of treatments, and that was one of the things I found was interesting, that they were giving this vaccination out, and that Pueblo actually received some of the vaccine, I think, due to Pueblo and CFNI's importance, the steel mill and the mining camp's importance to our economy. And so they probably wanted to try to make sure that they had as many healthy workers as they possibly could. So I'll send that link and you can send it out to the participants because it is fascinating.
Okay. We're also getting a request for the link to the poem. I think people really enjoyed
Sure.
that. Wouldn't mind sharing.
I can send out the whole photograph presentation if you'd like.
Great. Thank you. Question from Nancy. She asked, did the sale of Liberty bonds bring together people that ultimately spread the flu?
Yeah, I didn't read about any like particular one in Pueblo, but I think one place celebrations of the end of World War I caused congregations and people to get sick, and so I think parades and events like that really did affect when they thought they could come outside and congregate, that was going to keep them safe.
Let's see here. How about like how were Spanish flu symptoms different than some of the other flu, or like colds or sicknesses or things like that? Was there a way to distinguish?
Yes, so thought I had my notes about how terrible it was, but really, when people had these adverse reactions and these immune responses, the flu it would turn into this bacterial pneumonia symptoms. Their lungs would fill with fluid and blood. They would cough up blood. They would die quickly. It was really a terrible illness when people were affected by it. So it was really bad. People would basically asphyxiate.
Mhm.
So it was a lot stronger than a regular flu. You know, you feel like you've been run over by a truck, but in some cases, people, their lungs would just totally fill with blood, and they would die. So yeah, it was a terrible sickness.
Mhm. So John is asking, can you talk about the record keeping of deaths by counties in both Colorado and New Mexico? As a researching genealogist, I'm especially interested in documenting family deaths that occurred during this time period.
So I found my grandpa's record in the Mexico ancestry.com. So I found that interesting that they had that record keeping. I think you just have to look and see what type of deaths were taking place. I think probably, you know, whenever there's situations like this, sometimes records get lost or people don't take good records. So I think if you can just, sometimes people will have pneumonia listed as their cause of death, or sickness, or other types of words, and maybe not influenza, but you can probably infer if somebody died from some sickness that it was probably influenza related or a secondary symptom of influenza. I don't know if that answers your question, John, but it is interesting to look at that time period and see how your genealogy or your family tree changes. If people married, remarried, changed their names, could be an interesting project for you to work on.
So was there a difference in your research that you could find between deaths in Colorado and New Mexico?
So I will send another link of this letter. I did find a letter in New Mexico about the Pueblos and how they were affected. So they sent in an inspector. It's in a really amazing, I could pull it up perhaps. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes.
Let's see. Oh, here we go. So this is a visiting doctor from Albuquerque, and I'll send this link too because it's really interesting. It's a 9-page letter, but it identifies how the Native American Pueblos were affected by this, by the flu, and it gives a full report on the Pueblos. And so what we're seeing in New Mexico right now is that many of the Pueblos are affected by the coronavirus, and so it's very similar, but this talks about how you would enter a placito and find the inmates reclining on thin mattresses with their backs the cold wall, with hard racking coughs, some sneezing, children running at the nose, the temperature ranging from 102 to 105, the customary temperature being 103.105. And so it details how the Native American Pueblos were affected. So it's an interesting letter, and I'll send that link as well.
Do you mind talking a little more about what is contained in that letter? We did have a question about how Native populations may have been impacted or disproportionately impacted.
So this is just a report on how they were dealing with it. The pneumonias began sometimes immediately upon the completion of the influenza proper. So this doctor is really just detailing what he was seeing as he was going through. Throughout all the Pueblos, the same cause of death appears, and it is due to the ingestion during the progress of the disease of solid food. So it sounds like maybe sometimes they were asphyxiating. The medication of the Indian was a matter of secondary consideration to the maintenance of rest, regimen, and diet. This was markedly demonstrated in the case of Maria Benavides Isleta, a girl of 14 years old who is still alive. So he talks about a certain case, and he talks about just different people and how they were being affected. And at the end, let me see. "380 individuals were cared for at 90 placitas at Jemez." So you can see that was a huge amount of Native Americans who were affected. So it looks like this doctor went in and reported back on Isleta, Santo Domingo, Santa Clara, San Juan, Nambe, San Juan Ildefonso. So it's interesting that they had documented that.
And where was that letter found? Like
This is at the, I think the New Mexico archives.
Okay.
Yeah, and this was in December of 1918. Influenza epidemic at the Pueblos.
So I think we've got time just for a couple more questions. Gerald is asking whether rural and mountain peoples were affected to the point of mass burials, or if you came across any of that.
You know, I've heard that there were burials at the Roselawn Cemetery. I don't know that we were able to document that, but it's probably more indigent people who didn't have people to bury them, or also this problem with contagion and not being able to have a proper burial with your full family involved in your funeral. So I did not hear anything about mass burials, but probably indigent people could have been affected in that way.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question, I just have to read it because it has a nice note for you as well. Maria says, how did the coal camps of Southern Colorado fare? And then he follows up with, Maria, we miss you here in Colorado.
Oh, that's nice. I miss you all. I think, the coal camps, the Colorado, they mirrored the same as Pueblo and the other places. There was nothing that I saw that really stood out about the coal camps, other than they were also being treated by the CFNI hospitals and making makeshift hospitals. One thing I did note was that the women were asked to come in and serve as nurses at the coal camps, because the men were either working or at war, and so the women and other nurses had gone off to help with the war effort, and so women were called in to help. So the Industrial Bulletin, if you Google that, it's a great resource, and there's an entire report on the CFNI and what they did for the flu effort.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Maria, for joining us, and welcome back to Colorado, even if it was virtually. I know there's a lot of people that really enjoyed seeing you and hearing from you again this evening, so thank you.
Nice to share time with all of you. Thank you for taking this time and inviting me to participate. Like I said, I'm not an expert on it, but it is a really fascinating subject, and I learn more and more about it each day, even though my husband tells me to stop looking at it.
Well, we really appreciate it and appreciate your time. So also want to thank everybody who was able to join us this evening. As always, it's really a pleasure to have you. We wouldn't continue doing these projects if it wasn't for the support we're getting from you. I think we had over 200 people that joined us last week. We had close to that this week. And so again, the more support you provide to us, the more we're able to continue offering those programs. Having said that, we also want to thank the Heritage Area for all of their support, our donors for supporting public programming at History Colorado. Again, your support is valued and appreciated. For more and future events, please follow History Colorado and all of our museums, especially El Pueblo History Museum, Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, and Trinidad History Museum online and on social media for information about upcoming events. I do want to talk about what's coming up over the next couple of weeks before you tune out. The first is let's talk about our lecture series. We've got a couple of really great programs coming up next week and the week after. So next Thursday, April 30th, about 4 or 5 days before Cinco de Mayo. We're going to be joined by Dr. David Hayes Bautista. He's a professor of public health at UCLA, and he's going to talk about Cinco de Mayo, what he calls an American tradition. This is going to be outstanding. I've heard Dr. Hayes Bautista speak before. You definitely don't want to miss his presentation. On May 7th, we're going to do things a little bit different. We've got Manny Gonzalez. He's a former poet laureate for the city of Albuquerque. Manny is not a historian, but he's a renowned writer, poet, performer, and I know you're going to enjoy his talk, Canciones de mi Padre. It's about a personal connection that he has to the genre of New Mexico music, so we're excited about that. I want to talk about another really special event before we close that's going to be happening next week. Tuesday, April 28th at 1 p.m. is Connecting with the Truths of the Espinosa Brothers Saga. The way this project is going to work is we invite people to watch the video that's currently on YouTube. It explores the Espinosa Brothers story. It dives into truths, myths. We'll explore artifacts that currently exist in the History Colorado collection. It's about a 30-minute to 40-minute video. Watch that and then join us next Tuesday on the 28th at 1 o'clock for a live discussion with James Peterson and Matt Lopez from History Colorado and historian Virginia Sanchez, who we know many of you are familiar with. They're going to dissect the Espinosa Brothers story and also take questions from the audience. So this is going to be a really fun event. We invite you to come back for that. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you at one of our future events, and have a good evening.
Thank you so
I'm
much,
done.
Maria. That was super interesting.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, thank you. I hope everybody stays well there.
Thank you. Same
Yeah.
to you guys. Stay healthy. I'm going to send those links. Who should I send them over to?
Send them to me and I'll get them out with a follow-up email.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Have a good night.
that was really great, and we'll share with you all the great feedback. A lot of people really were excited to see you again and hear from you. So I think it was really special. Thank you.
Nice.
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Good
All
night,
right.
guys.
I'll send that information soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.